Well, good morning. Welcome to our webinar, and I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, paying my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Christina Talaco. I'm the chair of Coalition for Conservation. We are a not-for-profit that advocates for an effective climate agenda in line with conservative principles. Now, we've been engaging with conservatives around the globe, including the US Republicans, to develop a compelling message and also to support each other on our efforts. Over the past few years, center-right policymakers around the world have made significant progress on climate change, but we do know that much more can be done, and we must build on our progress and raise our ambitions. So today, as part of our international series, we will be welcoming our special guest joining us from the US, former Congressman Bob Inglis, and Australia's Consul-General in the US, Mick Greiner. And from Australia, we will be welcoming the member for Wentworth, Dave Sharma. Now, in terms of the format, I'll invite our guests from the US to make some remarks outlining their key messages, and then we will go straight into a panel for discussions, where I'll be asking our panelists questions, including those from the audience. So please type your questions on the Q&A box. The webinar will be recorded. We'll be sending a recording to everyone who registered. So let me start with Bob. Bob is a former South Carolina Republican congressman who used to be a climate skeptic, and now he travels around the country to advocate for climate action, promoting free enterprise solutions to tackle climate change. And to support his cause, he has created Republican, a grassroots community movement of more than 10,000 Americans who have united to address the environmental crisis. And for his work on climate change, he was given the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profiling Courage Award. So Bob, good evening, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us here in Australia today. Could you tell us about your inspiring personal trajectory and how you created this eco-right movement? And why do you think it's important for Republicans to come to the table?
Well, thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to be with you. Looking forward to talking with Nick and with Dave, and very much appreciate any opportunity to be with Aussies. You know, I had this wonderful opportunity to travel throughout Australia in 2017. 16 wonderful days of traveling all over, talking to conservatives in Australia, because we conservatives in America, I think, could use a little encouragement from conservatives down under, you know? So that's what that was about. And I'm always excited to talk with Aussies, because you're going to hear quite an Australian connection here. You know, I feel a need to explain, and I guess that's what you're inviting me to do, Chris, how it is that a conservative from a very conservative state in America, South Carolina, came to be involved in the climate effort, because it seems like a liberal cause, right? Something that progressives in America would be about, not what conservatives would be about. So for 6 years, I fit that mold. I was a conservative from South Carolina in the US Congress, saying that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And as much as I represented a very conservative district in South Carolina, that was the end of the inquiry for me. Okay, so I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for my first 6 years in Congress. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. Had the opportunity to run for Congress yet again, same seat, in 2004. That was a year that the eldest of our 5 kids had just turned 18, so he was voting for the first time. He came to me and said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. That's a new constituency. You know, those people can change the locks on the doors to your house. Very important to respond to that constituency. And so that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. Step 2 was going to Antarctica with the science committee and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. We can go into that if you want to in the Q&A time, what that evidence is. And then the 3rd step, this is the Aussie connection. We were at the Great Barrier Reef with the science committee, and this Australian climate scientist named Scott Heron was showing us the glories of the Great Barrier Reef and the challenge of climate change and its impact with coral bleaching. And I could see that Scott and I shared a worldview before any words were spoken, because I could see in what he was showing me that he was worshiping God. And so I knew we shared a worldview. Without any words, I knew that, because St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. So Scott Heron was preaching the gospel just without any words. Later had a chance to talk, and he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, who's now become a very dear friend, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raised Wages Cut Carbon Act of 2009. That's a revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon tax. And it didn't get very far in the Congress, and I didn't get very far after that because I got tossed out in a Republican primary. In part for that, well, there are a number of heresies that I committed against the Tea Party in America kind of orthodoxy that developed. But the most enduring heresy was just saying the climate change was real. Those were the dark days right after the start of the Great Recession, global financial crisis, and the commencement of the Great Recession. I'm very happy to say that things are very different now. And in the work that we're doing since I left Congress, to get conservatives in on this conversation, it's really going much better now than it did in those dark days of the Great Recession. Now we've got Republicans realizing that maybe they've got something to offer here. And that's what we're about at republican.org. So it's a team of 6 of us facilitating community, about 11,000 nationwide here in the US. And we're growing with part of where we call ourselves the eco-right, a balance to the environmental left. And so we're out to convince conservatives that they're really good on energy and climate. So engage. Stop shrinking in science denial because you think you're no good. Engage because the world needs you to lead on this. And so that's how this conservative got involved in climate, and how I've come to run this outfit called republican.org.
Thank you, Bob. It's such an inspiring story, and I'm glad to hear there's been progress, as you mentioned, but we'll come to that when we have a few questions for you more in detail on what sort of policies Republicans would be more willing to support and what are they still stuck. So now I would like to introduce Nick Greiner, who needs no introduction here in Australia. But Nick was appointed as Australia's Consul-General in the US this year. He's been a great supporter of coalition conservation. In fact, he's one of our ambassadors. Now, he was also Premier and Treasurer of New South Wales and Federal President of the Liberal Party. Nick, welcome. And can you please perhaps share so far what has been your experience in New York, talking perhaps the perspective of the major banks, investment houses, and also the corporates on these matters, which is really important. And perhaps share also insights on what's the current climate change landscape in the US. You just have to unmute yourself, Nick. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Is that better?
Much better.
Good. Thanks, Chris, Bob, Dave. Look, when I arrived here in February in New York, basically the job, Consul General for New York, was described to me once by Prime Minister Howard about 20 years ago when he offered me the same job. He said, it's like ambassador to Wall Street. And you're very well qualified, Nick, blah, blah, yeah, Harvard MBA and so on. And I thought, well, I'd arrive and I talked to everyone from the Australian head of Morgan Stanley and the semi-Australian Eskimo girl head of Citigroup and various others who don't have an Australian background. And of course, part of the discussion was about the economy of the world, particularly about the changing nature of relationships between China and the US, Australia, and so on. But the second issue that came up all the time, was the broad area of, let's call it climate change for want of another descriptor. And what I thought I'd do, Chris, if it's all right, I haven't had a journey like Bob. My government 30 years ago was an early interested party in this, but it was unusual at that time, of course, for the centre-right, for the Liberal National Party in Australia. What I wanted to do was talk briefly about the reaction from Wall Street. And I think the obvious conclusion that the horse has bolted, the stable is empty. This issue is no longer an issue of belief, an issue of, is this an issue? Is it all BS? It is actually a sheer economic reality. And the parties of the centre-right, the Republicans, the Liberal National Party, of course, pride themselves correctly on being good economic managers. And this is already, and has been in a sense for a number of years, a major economic issue. So I want to talk a little bit about, following the money. I think it's always a good idea to follow the money. It's whether you want to know what people really believe about China, or whether you want to understand where people really are at and where they're going on climate change. Yeah, following the money is not a bad direction. As I said, the horse has bolted. This issue is an absolutely major issue for all of the major banks, for all of the major financial houses, investment houses who invest pension funds, individuals' money. They are well down the road. And the notion that the centre-right, in whichever country, should deal itself out of this major economic issue is plain crazy. Let me give you just a few examples which perhaps people listening will find as interesting as I did. There is now a massive area of what they call green bonds. Basically, these are bonds where the money that is raised is undertaken to be used for the environment. Just last week, Walmart, which is, of course, the major retailer, issued $1 billion, and they said it was only the start of their green bond campaign. And in their case, I mean, they run essentially retail stores around the United States, Woolworths or Coles in the Australian vernacular. They're going to use it on renewables, on bringing their buildings up to standard in climate change terms, on environmentally friendly transport, which of course Amazon's also doing, and on zero waste. And whilst you could say that maybe companies used to get into green bonds because there was a very small cost advantage, that's almost completely eroded now in the United States. So the only reason for doing it is, I suppose, to indicate a direction. If you're being cynical, you could say virtue signaling, but I think that is clearly not the answer, certainly not the total answer. So in 2020, there was $1.1 trillion of green bonds on issue, and it's going in one direction, up, 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 dramatically up. Yesterday, I talked to some people from Vanguard. Vanguard's got a big business in Australia where they invest money for individuals, and they basically are very passive investors. And they said, look, we're a long-term investor in the companies. We're an index investor. We're not in and out. We basically own all the companies on that are in the index. But we're of the view that this is a fundamentally important thing for Vanguard and its stakeholders to do. And so even though we don't trade in and out, we actually find that the fastest growing area of the various funds we offer is green funds, funds that invest in environmentally acceptable, positive, well-run companies. And the same is true of BlackRock. BlackRock is the largest fund manager in the world. It actually started this move a few years ago. Larry Fink, their CEO, wrote a public letter and a letter to all of his investors saying that if they wanted to invest in BlackRock, they had to understand BlackRock was committed in this space. Another big local investor said to me that they invest money for a lot of Melbourne-based family offices, wealthy families in Melbourne. He said many of them are now totally requiring that the fund managers put them only into environmentally sensitive businesses. Then there are all the banks. All the banks bar one are in what's called the Net Zero 2050 Alliance. That's all the major US banks and indeed major banks in other parts of the world. And they're moving not only in terms of their own impact, but they're now thinking effectively about how their customers, the people to whom they lend and who rely upon them for the wherewithal to run businesses, how they get to net zero in 2050. So I think bottom line of that little point is the money's all going in one direction. The question of what's going to happen in the world in research terms, for what it's worth, I mean, I talk to all these research houses in the US, some very smart, many of them who work for the Future Fund in Australia, and the Australian government. And look, they say the following, and I think in these four walls we can be honest. They say they understand Australia's position, they understand the concern about the export coal industry, and which clearly has significant issues in getting to what people here call a just transition. And I think, frankly, organisations like yours, Chris, need to also acknowledge that. It's both a political reality because you can see our political opponents moving actually towards the centre on this issue. So they say, look, the market is going to prevail. Domestic energy almost everywhere, and certainly in Australia, there's going to be no new coal-fired power stations, even though one hears a bit about that from some strange people in the parliament. But there is going to be no new coal-fired power stations, or none of any relevance. Export is obviously harder, and the question of how you create a just transition for those areas in central Queensland and central New South Wales is not easy, and no one really has an easy answer. But the notion is that at the end of the day, it's about demand. And as demand changes, as the countries where we sell our exports change, this area it'll help us in terms of finding a so-called just transition. And for what it's worth, people say, look, oil demand and supply can be very hard to move in the sense that it's very hard to reduce oil. The so-called OPEC plus countries and Norway, which represent over half the world's oil, they've said, quote unquote, we're going to keep drilling, unquote. And the majors who are moving, the major oil companies, are only 10% of the world. My point on that quickly is just to say that what happens in the coal and oil industries, wherever you are, isn't easy. But that's not a reason for the centre right to take itself out of the debate, because that will only, politics cycles come and go. If we don't have a rational position and call it a balanced position, then at some point in the history of whichever country it is, you'll get a much worse outcome, if you like, when we have, the left of the Democrats in the United States, for example. So I don't know that I should go on any more either, other than to say this. The general view in New York is that the future, and you can see this in Mr. Biden's planned government spending, a lot of government spending in the EU, in the UK now, out of the EU, in the United States, is what you might call green. So important that at least it be good green. In other words, that there be a good combination of economic common sense along with the environmental goals. So the Conservatives need to be part of the solution, both for the good of the world and of the countries they're in, but also for themselves, because at the end of the day, this is, as I say, an area that in economic and political terms, there's only one direction, the horse is gone, and for us to hide our heads in the sand and say, well, we don't believe it, or we're going to stand and fight, is just not sensible for ourselves as Conservatives, or indeed for the country at large.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. I mean, you've covered so many areas that are truly important for Conservatives, especially the economy, which before, for us thinking about the transition, we used to think about the cost of it and no jobs and things like that. And right now, it looks like the corporates, the financial institutions, everybody's moved one direction because the money is there, isn't it? So we'll discuss that a bit later. I'd like to move on to now the panel and invite Dave Sharma, who is the Liberal member for Wentworth and a former diplomat himself, having served as Australia's ambassador to Israel. Dave has actually been putting pressure on the government here to commit to a more ambitious climate agenda and to play a bigger international role on climate. So welcome, Dave. And what I'll do is I'll kick off with a first question to the three of you, I guess. We have witnessed how fast the Biden administration, Bob, and especially you have seen that, how fast they moved in terms of climate change since they came into power. The US has rejoined the Paris Agreement. It has committed to net zero by 2050. And it's also got an emissions reduction goal of 50% now by 2030, with the aim, I believe, to encourage perhaps the world to seek more ambitious climate action as well. But how will that influence the pace of decarbonization around the world, and specifically for the Republicans, perhaps, and Australia? What is the important contribution that the Republican voices and the center rights play in this development of the future climate change action policies, especially when it comes to what's beneficial for the economy and the financial gains that we have, so that we don't become irrelevant? So I wonder if you'd like to start, Bob.
Yeah, you know, when I speak to audiences and there are a bunch of economists in the crowd, they probably wish that I would just say, internalize the negative externalities and be done with it. That's all it's about. That's all that we say at republican.org, really is. And it's something surely that I think, Nick, people in business really understand is if you there's three ways to deal with climate change. You can regulate emissions, you can incentivize clean energy, or you can price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels. The problem with that first one, regulating, even if we weren't conservatives, we'd be hesitant about it because from here in America, we can't regulate Chinese emissions. And if you regulate here, they don't regulate there. Manufacturers pick up and move from here to there. They emit more when they get there than they were emitting here because we're way more energy efficient than they are. So you go downhill on climate change. Same thing, I think, from the Australian perspective, is you don't want to outsource manufacturing capacity because if you do, you're going downhill. And so you got to get the world in on it. So the second way would be to incentivize clean energy. But the challenge there is, yeah, if you got a country that's prosperous like Australia or like America, you can probably afford that technology. But much of the rest of the world isn't going to be able to afford it, I'm afraid. And so the third way is the one where you adjust the economics. You make it so dirty becomes clearly more expensive because you now are putting on those products the full effects of their dumping on their neighbors or on the world. And we at Republican.org think this is rock solid conservatism, that it's exactly what Milton Friedman would tell us to do if he were still alive. You know, there's a great clip on our website of Milton Friedman on the Phil Donahue show, a TV show in the 80s here in America. Liberal Phil Donahue asked the very conservative Milton Friedman, what do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? Friedman says, you tax it, you tax pollution. And then he goes on to explain internalizing negative externalities. And it's why, Nick, I see a couple of your colleagues from Harvard Business School in the US Senate inclined toward this. Mitt Romney and a senator from Indiana. Mitt is from Utah, but we also have from Indiana, one of your colleagues from Harvard who they're looking at these kind of business-friendly approaches to fixing climate change. And they think, we just don't try to regulate my business, just price in the negative effects. We'll take care of the rest. And so I hope that becomes what conservatives say, yeah, that's what we've got to offer here. We've got something really good here.
Mick, would you like to comment?
I can't disagree with it. I could see myself getting into trouble if I was still in my previous Liberal Party. It's like the Republican National Committee chair, Bob. I think this is sensible to have an sort of open conversation. The problem is that the centre-right generally around the world says we are a party of low tax. And that's what we say in Australia. And therefore, 10, 12 years ago, we really won government by saying that a carbon tax, which is effectively a version of what Bob's talking about, and which is the most effective way of dealing with the problem, we said that was just a great big tax on everything. And at that stage, and the world has changed, I think, in Australia and elsewhere, but at that stage, that was a very powerful, simple, in the gut thing. Where for lower taxes, Labor or the Democrats here are for higher taxes. How can we be for a version of pricing in, as Bob says, the externalities, the costs that are being imposed? So I think that's this needs, I think time is our friend in some ways. I know there's a sense of urgency, but there's also a certain momentum which isn't going to be reversed, in my view. And you can see the Democrats at the moment, they quite like some of this because it helps tax. They're trying to raise revenue to do various other things that are on the Democrat agenda. In some ways, this, I suppose, from the centre-left point of view, is a quote-unquote good tax. And in some ways it is. Not all taxes are bad, although that is what in the simple political argument we tend to say. So I broadly agree. And there's some of that research I was talking about. They said, look, if you really want to change some of this, there is really, you're not going to effectively incentivize, which is Bob's second point. You're ultimately going to have to use taxes to make the real costs clear for the world. And I think as the education process keeps going, which clearly is fed, of course, by Bob's children and my grandchildren, I hate to say it, who are, some of them would ask me to vote for AOC if I was in New York voting. So you can see where my grandchildren are. My point is, sorry to go off the subject, Chris, but my point is that demography is on our side, time is on our side in that sense, but that's where, and it's going to be impossible for anyone to turn that back. It is a question of how you get there and how quickly you get there, and how you deal with some of the explicit social problems in West Virginia, where the US coal industry is, or in central Queensland, where the Australian coal industry is.
Absolutely, Nick. And the question of how we're going to get there, I'll talk to Dave about it, because here in Australia, of course, the approach has been technology will take us there, not taxes. Somehow it resonates a lot with us conservatives that technology will guide us and take us there. It may not resonate with other economies, though. So I was going to ask Dave, in terms of the US and Australia, we're quite similar, in fact. We export a lot of resources, we're highly agricultural. There's an issue with fossil fuels for us. And most Republicans, although I think now, Bob, you mentioned that they're starting to not deny that climate change is here and it's a threat, but they're still saying that abandoning oil and gas will harm the economy. So Dave, how does that go? Because with the technology, not taxes, are we going to get there in time, or do we need also targets or something extra to pushes and pulls and other policies? What will resonate with the government at this stage?
I think this is one of these policy issues where you could elegantly design a solution, and Bob's right in the sense that the most efficient way of addressing this is to price in the negative externalities. But the problem you run into are the sort of the straight political problems of that, but also the fact that, this is a global problem and it's the level of global CO2 emissions that matters here, but taxes are imposed at a jurisdictional level. And unless we're going to get a global uniform tax on CO2, you'll get a whole lot of arbitrage. And we've seen that happen where countries have introduced emissions trading scheme. What it's done is basically outsourced a lot of these emissions. So, I think we certainly do need a measure of that. I think we also need a measure, though, of regulation. When I think about some of the big global challenges that we've addressed in the environmental sphere, might be leaded petrol, for instance. How do we phase leaded petrol out of the supply chains? It was through regulation. Different countries did it in different times, but it wasn't the price differential that caused consumers to stop using it. It was government fiat. Chlorofluorocarbons, the destruction of the ozone layer, and the Montreal Protocol. How do we get CFCs and HFCs out of refrigeration and other goods? It was through an international agreement which effectively regulated them. We're all signing up to an international agreement on mercury, another very damaging chemical called the Minamata Convention. How are we doing that? We're all committing to phase it out. So I think there's a role for the regulatory side. There's certainly a role for more market-based mechanisms, and I think pricing externalities or taxing externalities is a part of it. But there's also an important role, and I think this is probably where most centre-right political forces agree, can find a point of agreement, is for consumer sovereignty, individual choice, and technology. Because what Nick highlighted, I think, is very powerful, that consumers and younger people and younger voters, and Bob's got the story of his own children, are increasingly demanding this, not just from their political leaders, but from the people that sell them goods. And the businesses that lend to those, the banks, the financial centres, the global capital markets, are equally demanding that of the people that they extend credit to. And I think as conservatives or centre-right people, we would always want to respect and follow those market forces and respect those decisions that individuals are making about the allocation of the money or where they purchase from. And I think that's a very powerful trend that really wasn't as apparent even 5 or 10 years ago, but is much more obvious now.
Thank you so much, Dave. Well, I suppose the market-based solutions like carbon pricing, there is already a voluntary carbon market, which a lot of companies have set their net zeros and they're trying to offset their emissions. But in terms of Republicans and here the conservatives or center rights, I suppose we're very far away from talking about a carbon tax. How far are the Republicans how far are they from supporting a revenue neutral carbon tax in the US, Bob? And I know that you mentioned a few Republicans like Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, they support charging companies for their emissions. But is it a conversation that's still very far from happening at the government level, at the Republican level?
Well, it is a way away just yet. We're not quite there yet, but you've just said the very important key words, Chris, which are revenue neutral. Because if you're a conservative and you want to price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels and you don't want to grow the government, well, there's a way to do that. It's through revenue neutrality by cutting taxes elsewhere, or by dividending all the money from the carbon tax back to the citizenry. I see some questions from CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby folks. That's their proposal. It's also the Climate Leadership Council proposal. here in America, those really make sense. And I think we've actually learned from the Australian experience, with the challenge for Australia in imposing a carbon tax is what Dave just mentioned, I think, which is that leakage problem where, you lose a productive capacity to other countries. You have no ability to really sort of force them to follow your lead. But here's the thing with Nick in this role, this diplomacy role, and Chris, you go into COP here soon. If we could get agreement in advance that we're going to have a border adjustment and have that, what Dave was referencing, which is some sort of harmonization of what it is that the carbon tax is going to be worldwide, that would really turn this thing into a worldwide solution. Because short of that, what you've got is even a country with an economy as large as the US trying to do this on its own, that's really difficult because it isn't solving the worldwide problem. You got to get the whole world in. And so the strength that we could have if we're ready to exercise it here in this American market is basically the ability to say to China and other countries, oh, you want access to our market? Well, fine, we're for that. It's just you're going to pay our carbon tax on entry of your goods. Oh, you don't like that? Well, sue us in the World Trade Organization. We think you're going to lose that case based on precedents in the chemical industry that say that you can have a content tax, and this would be a carbon content tax. And if we're right, and they do lose that case in the World Trade Organization, 24 hours later, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus in China, they would have the same price on carbon dioxide, right? Because otherwise they're paying on entry into an American port a US tax. They could have made that a Chinese tax, and the money would have been remitted to Beijing, and the goods would come through the American port with no adjustment. So it's crucial to get to that border adjustment. And it's what we really need the success of COP to be, is progress toward that mechanism by which Australia could impose a border adjustment, America could impose a border adjustment, or better yet, have it so that it's all arranged in advance, so you actually don't have to collect it at the borders because there's a system that's arranged in advance, and it encourages countries to follow the lead in establishing this carbon price. But here in America, as a conservative, what I hope is we don't use this as an excuse to grow the government, that we actually dividend the money back to the citizens, or that we cut taxes elsewhere, untax income particularly, and put a tax on carbon dioxide. Tax something you want less of, untax the thing you want more of. And we think that's rock solid conservatism, and sort of, if presented that way, can be acceptable politically.
And I think James Baker's, as you mentioned, there are a number of organizations, but James Baker, who's a very fine centre-right public policy figure, he advocated something similar. And at the end of the day, it feels like the right direction. The problem is that, of course, getting global agreement on the day of the week is not all that easy. And so it's a question of keeping, as I say, it's a matter of trying to keep the momentum going. And whilst it'd be nice to get an answer in Glasgow in 8 weeks' time, you've got to think that it's a progressive thing rather than a silver bullet sort of exercise.
Yeah. See, we'd have a hard time getting agreement even on this call. It's Monday. Monday is the day of the week. But Dave and Chris say, no, it's Tuesday.
It's Tuesday, yes.
What are you talking about?
That's so true. Well, I guess with the CBAM, we know that Europeans will definitely start imposing a tax on imports, from China and other countries that are not significantly reducing their carbon emissions. But we can turn that into an opportunity as well, as you mentioned, Bob, because for Australia, for example, I guess the opportunity story for us could be to manufacture green hydrogen to China, Japan, Korea, and all those countries that don't have sufficient solar or wind resources to produce. In that sense, then I'll ask Dave, because Australia is a pioneer in solar, and there's other technologies coming into scene here that will definitely assist us in getting to the net zero. So Dave, what do you think about the opportunities for Australia when it comes to exports and replacing what Nick was saying? The difficulty for us is to replace our exports of coal and obviously gas. How do you see that happening, that transition in a way that brings more jobs and actually doesn't leave those communities behind, which is the biggest issue for the regional Australians here?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, Chris, and I think sometimes people neglect wanting to address this element, because this is going to, look, it's a profound economic transformation that's underway in the world, and that's going to impose a profound structural adjustment, which means, in blunt terms, that's an economic term of art, but some sectors, areas, regions do well out of this, and some don't do so well and need to be compensated or retrained or reskilled, and we shouldn't hide away from that. And it's sometimes you get a sort of a Panglossian answer to this, where people say we're all going to be better, and in net terms, yes, we will be. But there will be people who are, unless they're compensated or looked after, worse off. And this is the source of political opposition in most countries. It's the people whose jobs feel most vulnerable, whose industries are in the firing line, and who are concerned about their own family, their own region, their own town, their own employer. And that's, unless you're prepared to acknowledge those uncertainties and anxieties, I don't think you can really build the political consensus to address this. I think in Australia, every country will have a different answer, but I think in Australia, we're actually quite fortunate in that we have a huge number of opportunities coming out of this. I mean, the nature of energy production and how it's going to change when we're operating a more electrified industrial system will be that it becomes cheaper to produce things at the source of power generation, be it solar or wind or hydrogen, than to convert that power generation into some sort of liquid form, ammonia, compressed hydrogen, ship it, and then process the good there. So for Australia in particular, I think of aluminium and steel. We don't produce in any significant quantities aluminium or steel. We export most of the raw products, alumina and iron ore, and we import most of the finished products, steel and aluminium back. Why is that? Because the cost of fossil fuels that you use to process those things, and coal or LNG or whatever it might be, is much cheaper to send those offshore, process them and send it back. In a low carbon world, where there is a price premium or some sort of advantage to having low emissions, steel and aluminium, you'd be much better off producing those goods close to the point of energy generation. So it would make sense, for instance, to have it, the old steel works at Whyalla with a huge huge solar generation capacity to smelt iron ore there and reduce iron ore there using hydrogen, ideally using renewable energy, and turn it into steel there. Same for alumina smelters. You're better off putting them close to hydrogen, hydropower facilities or renewable solar. So I think there is a huge opportunity here for Australia to reindustrialise in some sense. And the other big opportunity for our sector, which again goes to the regions, is in soil carbon, I think, because early studies show that soil carbon can be, one, a huge generator of carbon credits, but two, dramatically improve drought resilience, crop productivity, any number of things. And we're only really at the start of this. And the evidence suggests that, Australia's soil carbon has been depleted quite dramatically in the last 200 years through intensive farming and agriculture. But if we can, that's a huge opportunity for people in our agricultural and rural sectors to capture some of those credits from soil carbon. So they're just a few. Every country, I think, is going to be different, but we need to be very mindful of what are the new industries and jobs and sectors that will come out of this, and make sure that we're incentivizing those communities to focus on those things and less on the threats and challenges that are coming their way.
And you can see that with farmers, right, I think around the world. Farmers who are typically very conservative are I think, moving in the 30 years since I was in active politics. The farming community is keenly aware of the opportunities, the realities. They see it all around them. Farmers, by their nature, are conservationists, and so it's there. And if I could just make another small point, today I happened to see that the Colombian Oil Company, which is, I think, the second biggest in Latin America, in front of the biggest in the world, they are seeking expressions of interest for companies in the hydrogen supply chain. And they've noticed that Australian companies like Fortescue, Future Industries and others are heavily involved. My point is only that this isn't the traditional tribal thing where farmers don't want any interference and farmers are not interested in climate change, or where oil companies, I mean, major oil companies, like it's a state-owned oil company in Colombia, it is actually acknowledging that it needs to become expert in the hydrogen supply chain. So I think we're starting to get friends from unusual places, and but one does need to keep that going.
True. And Bob, I was reading about a survey by the Pew Research Center, very recent one this year, that when it comes to those policy proposals, and we just talked about renewables, but vast majority of Republicans seem to support carbon soil or planting trees. 88% of Republicans said that they would like to see more trees around the world to absorb carbon, providing tax credits to encourage business to develop technology to store carbon. But they also we still have the issue that 60%, 65% of these Republicans are saying that increasing jobs is very important for them. And also 61% say that keeping consumer costs low is important to them, very similar to Australia. So it's sometimes hard to reconcile what we're doing with the job situation and how we're going to generate those jobs. But I wanted to start now just perhaps reading some of the questions that are coming on this Q&A box, because it's getting pretty large. And one thing that I wanted to touch upon that we haven't discussed is perhaps we talk a lot about domestically reducing emissions and things like that, but we hardly think about this national security issues with climate change. So I wanted to get your opinion, the three of you, maybe starting with Bob. How does that play with Republicans, national security, in terms of the threats that we're facing with climate change? Is that a compelling message for Republicans to come on board?
It's becoming more compelling. During President Obama's years, the Pentagon was telling us that climate change is a force multiplier and we really need to address it. And I think a lot of Republicans thought, well, there are politics in the Pentagon too, and that's some guy or gal looking for a fourth star, and they need that from the White House, and so they're sucking up to President Obama. Then we had 4 years of President Trump, and the Pentagon kept saying the same thing. At that point, those people were at risk of never getting that fourth star, right? And so actually, they became, therefore, I think, even more credible than they'd already been in saying, oh, no, this is a serious problem, a serious national security problem. And so, when you have people pick up and move quickly, migration becoming a real threat because of necessity, either, the crops have failed because of drought or whatever. I mean, you can make the case that that's what happened in Syria. In Syria, right? Is that we had that going on, and so that's. I think it's a very good point of entry into the Republican mind here in America, is to talk about national security, because it has compelling. We have compelling. Diplomats for that, being people in uniform here in the Pentagon.
Very well. Nick, do you want to comment on the national security?
Oh, only to say that I think that's right. I think national security is one of those issues that is not that many issues that are clearly boundary spanners, but I think that is one that tends to be, certainly in Australia, more so than here. National security tends to be very seldom contested at elections. And so the fact that it's clear that climate change is indeed a strategic risk is very well apposite in terms of trying to get some progress.
Dave, are there any talks at Parliament level on national security? Also, the fact that climate change will not just create security threats nationally, but it's going to create a huge refugee crisis. That's what's predicted. when especially we're in an area which is quite vulnerable here, not for Australia, but for a lot of the islands around us?
It's undoubtedly in our neighbourhood a big concern for the countries of the Southwest Pacific, particularly the smaller island states of the Southwest Pacific, and they have been, to their credit, some of the most vocal voices on this debate internationally through the Pacific Islands Forum and other means. So I think that's certainly occupies Australian minds and is a concern. More broadly, though, I mean, this is obviously potentially going to have quite significant humanitarian impacts. Places like the Sahel, parts in the Middle East, Bangladesh, countries which have a lot of people that tend to practice quite marginal agriculture, which means they're quite sensitive to individual climate movements or an individual drought. I mean, even in southern Madagascar today, there's a pretty severe drought and sort of the early stages of a famine. And at least one of the causes of that is climate change, in the sense that there's more higher intensity of and higher frequency of severe weather events causing agriculture that would normally be viable not to be viable. And I think we're only really at the start of seeing some of those impacts now.
Certainly. Well, Dave, while you're still there, there's a question for you, actually. The COP26 Climate Summit is coming up. Community members across the country are calling for an increase to Australia's 2030 climate target. Would you personally support perhaps matching the US level of ambition at 50% cut this decade?
Well, I'm not going to make commitments here on a Zoom call about conversations I'm going to have with my Prime Minister and other ministers, Christina. But what I would say is I do support Australia having a net zero target by 2050 and making that quite emphatically clear. And I think what necessarily follows from that, and particularly if you look at the most recent IPCC report, is that we need to be further along in the interim targets and the earliest targets, including 2030 and 2035, than what we initially planned to be a few years ago. So I think, the IPCC report makes clear that a higher level of ambition and a higher rate of progress is needed from all of us. And I include Australia in that, but I'm not going to, commit to something specific in a call about something that's a topic of conversation with my own colleagues.
Absolutely. And now, Bob, there's a question for you that I've received, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to fully answer this, but there are suggestions that the current efforts to recall Gavin Newsom in California are motivated to reel back the climate initiatives the government and legislature have put in place in the state. How entrenched are those policies currently, and will industry continue along the path to reduce emissions, even if the directives and incentives change?
Well, I think the polling indicates here most recently that Gavin Newsom's probably going to survive. Probably our friends in Australia think this is the strangest situation we are going in in a state that comprises, well, if it were a country, it'd be 1/7 of the world economy, right? So I mean, I'm sorry, that's not correct. It's 1/7 of the American economy. That one state is 1/7 of our of the U.S. economy. So it's hugely important to our country, and yet those in the East, we call it the land of fruits and nuts. And so that's sort of the way California is perceived. And I got to tell you, they got the wackiest system of elections where all kinds of things go on sort of crazy in California. But all that said, the polling indicates that Gavin Newsom's probably going to survive. If by some chance he didn't, I got to believe that it'd be a one-off situation, and most of those initiatives would remain, probably because the people in California are really sensitive to the concern about the environment. They're like some places in Australia where they're really, there's some populations that are really concerned. And the Californians have a history of that, because for quite a while, you couldn't see the mountains, from a coastal city. From Los Angeles, you couldn't see the mountains because of the smog. And that really got them going. And it's not just Republicans. I mean, it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans who agree with that. A little bit like the way that Utah is. It's one of the reasons that Mitt Romney is being able to do the things that he's doing, not just because he is a Harvard MBA and understands internalizing negative
Although that's
externalities,
important, of course.
but it's also because of him being in Salt Lake City and the winter inversion problem, which creates this bad air in the winter. And whether you're a Republican mama or a Democrat father, you say, do something about that air. And that's, so I think that you can pretty much expect that California will continue to be a leading jurisdiction for environmental protection in America, is just some of that.
Thanks, Bob. We're running out of time, so I'd just like to ask each of you for maybe some final observations, and especially to focus, because we're here connecting, Australians with Americans. What's the importance of this international collaboration for center rights and for the Republicans? And how can Australia and the US influence other countries to reduce emissions, but also have a compelling narrative to convince our own governments that we need higher ambitions, and of course, still following a very much a sustainable or an economically viable narrative? Nick, would you like to start?
Well, I think the first answer is that this is clearly, and Dave and Bob have been saying, there's clearly a universal problem, a global problem. And so it's perfectly apparent that you need significant global answers. And that's happening, as Bob was saying earlier, in a variety of areas of tax. We're doing it now with tax on the big technology companies. So there is starting to be a bipartisan view. And I think the more you can do that, the better. And could I just say, because it'll be my last chance, there's been some really good questions that maybe you should circulate, Chris, in some way. But my answer to a lot of them is saying, well, is the number quite right? Do we have to go faster than 2050? I think it's a bit like COVID. The reality is we don't really ultimately know. We know where we need to go, but I don't think we should be over-egging this has to happen by this year in order for this to happen. It's the direction that is needed. It's the continued pressure for change in the same direction that is the answer. And I think that applies to technology. It applies to estimates of, what percentage is going to happen when, because I'm a big fan after I've been in politics, of governments telling people when they don't actually know. And I think we do tend to overstate in this and in other areas that we know the detail of the answer. That makes it harder. If we say we know the direction we need to go, I think that's more believable to the average person who is well-intentioned, but perhaps not passionate.
Thanks, Nick. Bob, would you like to talk about international collaboration? But also, I've just found out here that there's an interesting question. Somebody's asking you if your group is bringing together members of this eco-right group with those in the environmental left and with those on the right. So how do you bridge the divide?
Yeah, ultimately, we think that we can bring America together and lead the world to a solution here. But it starts with getting conservatives more comfortable with the conversation. The progressive left in America is quite comfortable with the conversation. It's been a conversation that's been in their language and not in the language of the right. And so we are among others who are trying to introduce the language of the right, free enterprise, concepts of accountability and responsibility, and also a return to the belief in the importance of the commons, something that's sort of been lost here of late, or really diminished in the conservative mind. So we need to bring that back. But after we've gotten that message through to conservatives, and yes, we think that it's quite possible to bring the country together. And as to the collaboration with Australia, everybody has some people they're particularly feel an affinity toward, and I think that's true of nation states. So I don't know whether I've seen any polling data on this, but I just think that Americans really like Australians and like the Brits. And we're a little, even though here in South Carolina, we're relying on a German company called BMW that makes an awful lot of very nice cars here. We sort of don't cotton too much to what the Europeans have to tell us. But we feel that our cousins in Australia and our cousins in the UK are our friends. And so that's why when I had that wonderful opportunity with the Australia Institute to visit Australia back in 2017, it's really clear that was a good thing to do from our perspective here in America, because to be able to come home and say, well, here's what the Australians are thinking, it really helps when you're talking to American conservatives. So, all it takes to be a success in America, by the way, is an Aussie accent, a Kiwi accent, or a British accent. Any of those will make you an instant success in America. So that's just the way it is, I think. So yeah, there's a tremendous opportunity here, particularly to show American conservatives that we're not alone in this. Our cousins in Australia, our cousins in the UK are moving too. And then, of course, we have other connections too, like a certain news network that has a big impact there and here, and so we'll see about that too.
Fantastic, Bob. I will ask Dave to wrap up. Dave, in fact, we didn't discuss this, Bob, but the Republicans have created a conservative climate caucus within Congress, and there's about 60 new members. To just show that they can coordinate themselves and be a voice for climate change. Dave, is there any appetite in Australia to create a caucus within Parliament, perhaps in the future, to, amongst the coalition or the Conservatives? I think it's a very effective way of actually putting forward discussions and policies. And after that, I'd let you wrap up because we all have to go.
Sure. Look, it's a good idea, Christine. There is actually, there's a number of informal caucuses. They don't have names, but there's a group that I chat with pretty regularly within the party, and some of whom are on the call here today, listening in, I think, who take a close interest in this within the Liberal Party and are pushing for our side of politics to adopt a higher level of ambition and a greater sense of responsibility on this issue. I'll wrap up now, Christina, because I know it's close to 10 o'clock, but I did want to, on behalf of everyone here who's on the call, thank Bob and thanks Nick for giving us your time. I think, Bob, your insights as someone from a red state who was a Republican, I think are fascinating to us because American politics can often be difficult to understand from Australia. And I think where the Republican Party and the conservative side of American politics goes on this issue will have quite a big impact, not only on US policy, but because global politics and conservative movements around the world often take their lead from what's happening in America. So all strength to your arm in seeking to change that direction and seeking to highlight the principles which are conservative principles, which should be enlivening this debate and informing policy issues. Nick, for those on the call, Nick was one of the first people who encouraged me, or when I went to seek his advice about getting into politics, Nick was, I hope I'm not misstating you here, Nick, an encouraging voice who encouraged me to persist. And he's been a real mentor and a great source of counsel and advice ever since. And it's great to have you in such an important role, Nick, for Australia globally now as Consul-General in New York. And I think the perspective you gave us and the insights you have from basically the global capital markets is, I think, a particularly important one for Australians to hear, because we are throughout our modern history, we have been a capital hungry, capital importing, highly globally integrated economy, as you know. And so the financial markets and what they're doing, and pension funds and banks and everything else, is of great importance to our ultimate economic prosperity and security in Australia. And I think that's an important argument within the domestic political debate here in Australia too. So thank you both very much for your time and your insights. Thank you to all the guests on the call, and it's been wonderful to join you all this morning and this evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dave.
Dave.
Bob, thank you. No doubt we'll have you again on our events list. And Nick, all the best in New York. Hopefully the borders will reopen and we'll be seeing you very soon. Thanks everyone who joined. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Chris. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.